Well, there have been enormous changes. First of all, Saudi Arabia joined the World Trade Organization, which meant that the peculiar rules that it had applied to trade and investment yielded to international rules. So it really joined the world economically in a way that it hadn't. Second, various border issues were solved. Saudi Arabia had unresolved borders with many countries, including Iraq and the UAE, these were solved, as well as the border with Yemen. Saudi Arabia came under heavy pressure from the United States after the end of the Cold War to adopt Western standards of behavior with regard to women and democracy and other issues, and it resisted these very firmly. 9/11 occurred. Most of the perpetrators of 9/11 were Saudi, usually from the Saudi Southwest. This put a strain on Saudi Arabia's reliance on the United States. For the past 20 years, the kingdom has been engaged in trying to diversify its international relationships, to dilute reliance on the United States, and to reposition itself. And more recently, it has acted pretty much independently without regard to any foreign advice. It began this process in association with the UAE. The two Mohammeds were very close. There have been some differences since then, but really in Saudi Arabia, in a way, aligned itself with the UAE, which has been very active internationally for the first time over this period. So many changes, but perhaps the biggest change was internal. When King Abdullah died and was succeeded by King Salman, the nature of the domestic political system, which had been based on shura within the royal family primarily, but also including wealthy merchants and the like, tribal leaders, this changed. From when I was ambassador at the beginning of the 1990s, I suppose there might have been some 20, perhaps, family lineages, descendants of the founder of this kingdom, Abdulaziz Al Saud. There might have been 20 lineages that had to be consulted on any serious policy issue. By the time Abdullah died, that was down to perhaps a dozen. Under Salman, essentially, Mohammed bin Salman and his father make all the decisions. So you've seen a retreat from shura to a form of autocracy. This has enabled many reforms: greater rights for women, a more open economy in terms of entertainment, and many other things that please the Saudi middle class. But it has meant a distancing Saudi Arabia toward a less austere form of Islam than the one it inherited from the followers of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab of the 18th century. So I'd say that this has been a period of remarkable change. But in Saudi Arabia, typically, change is top down. It comes from the top, and many people don't notice it until it has already occurred. It's as though you were driving a car and you don't see where you are until you look in the rearview mirror. So looking back, one can see extraordinary changes over this 30-year period. I think, yes. I mean, Saudi Arabia is opening up in interesting ways. For example, the NEOM project on the Red Sea, tourism, which was something unheard of, the exploitation of pre-Islamic archaeology from the Jahiliyyah, which was never acceptable in Saudi Arabia, is now very much featured in its international image. So you have a combination of things that make the kingdom more attractive. On the other hand, it's still a difficult place in many ways to do business. Red tape, indecision, sometimes surprises as a result of the anti-corruption campaigns, all get in the way of business relationships. No, I think there has been a problem inside Saudi Arabia, which the kingdom has attacked quite frontally. It has directed a campaign, propaganda campaign, against jihadi theology, public education, and its security forces have basically followed a policy of first advising anyone who appears to be adopting jihadi philosophy not to do it, including bringing to bear pressure from their families on them, and then taking those who seem to be on the course toward terrorist activity into custody and re-educating them. And finally, if someone does actually cross the line and become involved in terrorist activities, they are very promptly killed. I think the relationship is quite fragile. Traditionally, there were 6 areas of convergent interest that united the United States and Saudi Arabia. The first was a bargain to protect the kingdom in return for assured access, preferential access to the kingdom's energy supplies. But the United States is now an exporter of oil and gas. We are a competitor of Saudi Arabia. We're no longer dependent on it. Of course, we're concerned about Saudi policies on energy because they directly affect global prosperity, on which our own prosperity depends. The second area was Islam. Saudi Arabia excluded extremists from the pulpit in Mecca or Medina. And so it was a moderating force, even though its own theology was quite sharp. Islamophobia has now taken root in the United States after 9/11, and this partnership is no longer there. Saudi Arabia acts in its own interest without regard to the United States. Then there is the issue of transit through Saudi airspace and coastal waters. Egypt and Saudi Arabia sit at a global bottleneck. You cannot get between Asia and Europe except by flying through their skies. So, especially because Iran has been closed. So the Saudis continue to tolerate American overflight, which is essential to the United States remaining a power with global reach. So that has not changed. Commercially, Saudi Arabia was the largest market for the United States, 50% of the market from Morocco to India, a very large area indeed. It has now been surpassed by the UAE as the American principal trade partner in that region. The Saudis traditionally were willing to finance American foreign policy. The most famous example is the support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet occupation. but there were other examples. But Saudi Arabia no longer has the money or the willingness to do that. So there has been a divorce in that area. And finally, there is the issue of counterterrorism. We have the same enemies, therefore we work together. And Saudi Arabia is a major source of intelligence about jihadi threats to Americans and the United States. This is the only area of the relationship, that is counterterrorism, that remains robust and healthy. The others are all either qualified or they have disappeared. So this means, especially after the assassination of my friend Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul, that the relationship is bad, and opposition in the United States to the Saudi intervention in Yemen makes it worse. So we have an executive branch, a Biden administration, which is trying to sustain a balanced relationship with Riyadh, and we have a Congress that, for the most part, is quite anti-Saudi. Yes, I think the opinions of Saudi Arabia will be taken into account by the Biden administration, but I don't think there is any commitment to obtain the approval of Saudi Arabia for whatever is agreed with the Iranians. I am very skeptical at this point that there will be an agreement with Iran. I think the negotiations have largely been bungled, and I don't see a clear path to a resumption of the JCPOA. I think there has been an inevitable retreat from the focus on the Gulf. This has many factors behind it. I mentioned some. We are no longer dependent on energy from the Gulf. That changes the equation. We are no longer allied with Islam against communism. We have more commerce now with other regions than we do with the Gulf. And of course, the Gulf is in some respects a source of terrorism, which is a concern. But our greater concern now appears to be with the rise of China and the resurgence of Russia. So our focus has shifted and is shifting toward East Asia and Eastern Europe, and is less apparent when you talk about the Gulf. I think that it's very clear that democracy in the United States is in difficulty. Mm-hmm. Americans are very dissatisfied with the direction of events. We are quite disunited. We seem to have difficulty reaching decisions. So if the premise is that the United States will compete with, contend with, confront China and Russia, we are weaker. And our competitive capacity, which depends on our domestic situation, is less. So China and Russia can take some comfort from the internal difficulties of the United States, and our failure to rebuild our infrastructure, improve our educational system, develop an effective immigration policy, develop a taxation system that restores equality of income distribution and equality of opportunity. All of these things are in difficulty in the United States. And while there are efforts being made now to address all of these issues, they are being addressed partially, slowly, and not terribly effectively. So if I were Chinese or Russian, I would look at the United States and see a less than effective response to their challenge. This is a natural result of the effort by the kingdom that I referred to diversify its international relationships. Unfortunately for the kingdom and others in the Gulf, like the UAE, the only country that can effectively project power to the region from outside is the United States. Russia has shown that it is once again militarily competent through its intervention in Syria, for example, but it does not have the ability to intervene to defend countries in the Gulf, and has made no commitment to do so. China is even less capable. So, and the former imperialist powers of Europe, Britain, France, Germany, don't have any independent capacity to project power. Turkey is back as an independent actor, having spent more than 2 centuries trying to become European. It is rediscovering its West Asian and North African identity. People talk about the Ottoman Empire coming back, but this is really an identity issue for Turkey, that it is now identifying with what people call the Middle East. I don't like the term Middle East because it is centered on Europe. I prefer West Asia and North Africa. So Turkey is once again a major player in the Arab world and to some extent in Africa, as well as Central Asia. And this is a major change in the geopolitics of the region. Well, I think, as I said, countries in the region are asserting independence. They don't want to be over-reliant on any country. They are all looking for their own interests and advantages in relations with great powers. And so, yes, the United States, which once had an essential monopoly on power in the region, is now joined by Russia, China, European powers. This is good and bad. It is good in the sense that this gives the countries of the region an incentive to address problems that previously neglected because they felt they could live under the protection of the United States. So you see, for example, realpolitik, realism coming out of Abu Dhabi in relation to Israel. So this is an effort by a major Gulf country to adjust to a new reality in which events in the region are driven by the countries in the region rather than by external powers like the United States. So that's good. What is bad is that this introduces a lot of uncertainty and insecurity, and it increases the danger of arms races, including a possible nuclear weapons program in Iran, to be followed by others elsewhere in the region. So there are pluses and minuses to the change. Well, Saudi Arabia is, of course, vastly larger in population and territory and economic size than any other country in the Gulf. A much more complex society in many ways. And in some respects, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which was formed in 1980 to counter the Iranian Islamic Revolution, functioned as an extension of Saudi power. The rift between Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the more troubled relationship between Saudi Arabia and the UAE means that the GCC is even less effective than it ever was. There is no unity really among the countries of the Gulf in relation to the challenges they face from countries like Iran or Turkey. They are divided. So Saudi Arabia's relations with the Gulf have become more competitive. You now see the Saudis trying to force the relocation of corporate headquarters from Dubai to the kingdom, and you see a greater effort to compete with other countries in the Gulf in many respects. So this is a more complex relationship too. I think the Saudis are much more realistic today than they were 4 or 5 years ago. They regret their war in Yemen, for example. They have had to accept an adjustment in policy towards Syria. They are aware that Turkey is a player in the region and they have to deal with Turkey. So these aspects of realism, including a dialogue with Iran now, and an effort to reestablish cooperation with Iraq, these changes in Saudi policy reflect a greater realism on the part of Riyadh. They also, I think, reflect the greater independence from the United States that I mentioned. This is Saudi Arabia positioning itself with its neighbors in the region and putting priority on them. It has also finally overshadowed some of the major differences between Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Turkey. Qatar has aligned with Turkey in part because it espouses a form of Islamist democracy, the Muslim Brotherhood being a case in point. I'm not making a case for the Muslim Brotherhood, which proved to be entirely incompetent when it took power in Egypt. Sadly, it was not up to the task. But there is a difference in the Mashriq. There is a difference between those countries that want to pursue a more democratic form of Islam and political system, and those that want to preserve the traditional systems, basically modeled on tribal governance, what some of my Yemeni friends dismiss as Badokratia. This is a sort of traditional way of governance in the Gulf, and it is not democratic, although it does have elements of shura that are important. So we see political change occurring, and we see resistance to that change, as well as people trying to ride the wave, which I take to be the strategy of Qatar. In the short term, the relationship is very tense and dangerous. That is because both sides, the United States and China, have ceased to talk to each other and instead are trading insults. So this is not effective diplomacy. I always recall the remark of Bismarck, the great German statesman, who said, "You should always be polite, even when you declare war." But we are not being polite, and we don't leave much room for cooperation. On the other hand, we have no choice. Many problems in the world, whether they are geopolitical or planet-wide, have to be dealt with through cooperation between the United States and China. Afghanistan is actually a very good example of this. It's an example of several things. First, the last 20 years have not been about so-called great power rivalry. They have been a struggle between Western occupying force and Afghan nationalists, or maybe just Pashtun nationalists. So this had nothing to do with great power rivalry. But the United States has now exited Afghanistan, somewhat disgracefully in my view, but we are out. Now, what is to happen? Every country around Afghanistan, and some well beyond it, share the same concerns. We don't want Afghanistan to engage in civil war, continued civil war. We don't want Afghanistan to become a hotel or an inn for terrorists or a training ground. So we want them not to harbor terrorists. We don't want extremist versions of Islam to affect Central Asia or Pakistan. We don't want the drug trade to flourish. We would like to see the end of the narcotics industry in Afghanistan. And we'd all like to see the best possible treatment of women under the new regime. And I don't think there's any difference on these issues between China, Russia, the United States, even Pakistan, Iran, India, or the Gulf. I think there is a basis for creative diplomacy to influence and support the new Afghanistan. But we will see whether great power rivalry allows us to do that.